Chapter 1. The Sirens at Sunset. The blue and red lights painted the side of my barn like some twisted county fair attraction, strobing across the wooden panels as if the universe had decided to throw me a light show. And there she was, Karen, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they could have vacuum-sealed the smugness right off her face. She stood right at the edge of my driveway, practically vibrating with self-importance, pointing at my goats as though she had just uncovered a federal crime syndicate. I'll admit, the way the officers glanced between her, my animals, and their own notepads felt like the build-up to a verdict. Karen thought she had won, and for a brief second, the smug little smile tugging at the corner of her mouth made me wonder if she truly believed she was starring in her own made-for-TV courtroom drama. The air smelled like hay, tension, and cheap perfume, and then the officer finally opened his mouth. That's when Karen's smugness shattered like glass on concrete, because the law and the truth weren't on her side. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you've ever had a neighbor who thinks they're the sheriff of suburbia, or worse, the self-appointed general of an HOA army, you already know the flavor of hell I was living in. And trust me, this wasn't some oopsie misunderstanding or quirky personality clash. This was a deliberate, entitled crusade to dismantle my life piece by piece. My animals weren't just pets, they were licensed therapy animals, and Karen didn't just hate them. She hated what they represented: independence, joy, and something she couldn't control. By the way, before we go further, quick question for you watching this. Where are you watching from? I always love seeing the comments from folks across the states, and even those of you tuning in from other countries who can't believe HOAs like this actually exist. Stick around, because by the end of this story you'll see exactly how I turned Karen's self-righteousness into her ultimate undoing. But first, let me set the stage. My name is Ryan Caldwell. I'm 36 years old, and by profession, I'm a licensed occupational therapist. My specialty: animal-assisted therapy. It's not a hobby, not a side hustle, not a cute little farm thing like Karen loved to sneer about. This is what I do for a living, and it's state-certified, federally recognized, and backed by more paperwork than Karen could ever hope to staple together in her life. My goats, chickens, and even my donkey aren't just barnyard background noise. They're working animals, therapy providers, and the reason dozens of kids and veterans in my county sleep a little easier at night. But you think Karen cared about that? No. To her, my place was just an eyesore with livestock. I moved into this neighborhood with the naive hope that being outside of the city limits would mean fewer rules, less oversight, and maybe even some like-minded neighbors who appreciated wide open spaces. Instead, I walked right into the jurisdiction of one of the most suffocating HOAs in the state. Picture a bunch of retirees who had weaponized bylaws like they were collecting trading cards, each one more absurd than the last. Lawn too green? Fined. Fence 2 inches higher than regulation? Fined. Mailbox not in HOA-approved beige? Guess what? Fined. And right at the center of it all was Karen, the self-appointed compliance officer, who wore her petty power like a badge. Now, to be fair, I probably made myself an easy target. I wasn't the type to smile politely at every committee meeting. I wasn't the type to fold my entire life into their cookie-cutter vision of suburban paradise. I built a barn. I hung a hand-painted sign welcoming clients to the property. And yes, I kept animals. Licensed animals, protected animals, but animals nonetheless. And for Karen, that was blood in the water. It started small. Notes left under my doormat telling me my rooster's crowing violated the noise ordinance, even though that ordinance applied only to machinery, not animals. A complaint about the smell, though multiple county inspections confirmed my property was spotless and up to code. And then, the piece de resistance, anonymous letters mailed to other neighbors, whispering that I was running some kind of illegal petting zoo. The irony? Half of those neighbors had brought their kids to my therapy sessions themselves. But Karen didn't stop there. No, she escalated. She always escalated. The first official HOA notice arrived in a crisp white envelope with that self-righteous logo stamped on top, demanding I remove all non-domestic animals within 30 days or face fines of $200 a day. Non-domestic. As if my therapy-certified goats were somehow a threat to her property value. And that was just the opening shot in a war I hadn't asked for, but one I was absolutely prepared to finish. I didn't respond. At least, Not the way she wanted me to. Karen expected me to panic, to fold, to start packing up hay bales like I'd been caught smuggling contraband. But instead, I smiled. Because I knew something Karen didn't. You see, in my line of work, it's not just about caring for people. It's about navigating systems, paperwork, certifications, and regulations that would make an IRS auditor cry. I had a filing cabinet that could bury her in federal statutes and ADA protections. Karen thought she was playing checkers, but I was holding the entire chessboard. Still, I knew this wasn't going to stop with letters and fines. People like Karen never stop when they think they've found a weak spot. They keep pushing, clawing harder, until they hit something solid. And sure enough, one late summer evening, I heard the distant wail of sirens getting closer, until those flashing lights splashed across my barn. Karen had made her move. And it was about to backfire spectacularly. The cruisers pulled into my driveway like they were rolling up on a cartel bust. Tires crunched against the gravel, radios crackled, and 2 officers stepped out with the kind of cautious authority you'd expect when someone calls 911 and screams about illegal animals running rampant. Their flashlights cut across the barn, across the goat pen, and then finally settled on me, standing there with a bucket of feed in my hands like the world's most dangerous criminal. And of course, Karen was there too. She had emerged from the shadows like some triumphant villain, clutching her smartphone as if it were the smoking gun. You'd think she had just taken down Al Capone. The way she positioned herself behind the officers, lips curled in smug anticipation, you could almost hear the inner monologue. Finally. I've won. Goodbye, barnyard circus. The goats, for their part, were entirely unfazed. Daisy, my oldest therapy goat, ambled right up to one of the officers and gave him a gentle nudge in the knee, demanding the attention she usually reserved for nervous children. The officer looked down, then back at Karen, then back at the goat, and I swear the confusion on his face was the sweetest appetizer before the main course. Now, let me backtrack for just a second, because here's where Karen's plan really unraveled. When you call 911 in my county, the dispatcher doesn't just send officers blindly. They log the complaint, check relevant codes, and if the call involves animals, they loop in animal control. Which meant that 5 minutes after the cruisers arrived, another truck pulled up, and out stepped someone who knew me by name, Officer Jenkins from County Animal Services. Karen didn't recognize him. But I did. Jenkins had been to my farm countless times, not for problems, but for inspections, renewals, and certifications. He'd petted Daisy, admired the therapy chickens, and even once sat in on a session for a veteran struggling with PTSD. He knew the paperwork. He knew the law. And more importantly, he knew Karen was wasting everyone's time. She didn't know it yet, though. Oh no, Karen was still basking in her imagined victory, chin tilted, eyes narrowed, waiting for the cuffs to click. And here's where my petty side kicked in. Instead of blurting out my defense right away, I let the moment breathe. I let her marinate in her self-satisfaction, building her little fantasy higher and higher, so the fall would sting that much more. The officers did their routine. They asked me what was going on, asked about the animals, and asked if I knew why the neighbor had called. I answered calmly, almost cheerfully, while Karen muttered in the background about illegals, and diseases, and property values. I could see her shadow stretching long in the flashing lights, like some cartoon villain monologuing before the big twist. And then, just when she was hitting her stride, Jenkins stepped forward with his clipboard. Now, you might think this is where the story ended, that Jenkins waved his magic pen, shut Karen down, and sent everyone home. But oh no. That would have been too merciful. Instead, Jenkins decided to do things by the book, which meant pulling out the official binder of state regulations, flipping to the highlighted sections, and explaining, out loud, in front of Karen and the officers, that therapy animals are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Protected. Untouchable. Bulletproof. Karen's face drained faster than a kiddie pool in August. She stammered something about farm zoning, only for Jenkins to calmly clarify that my property was within agricultural allowance and my animals were registered. She tried pivoting to noise violations, but the officers quickly reminded her that livestock noises weren't covered under that ordinance. Each attempt she made to salvage her complaint crumbled under the weight of reality, until finally she was just standing there, red-faced and fuming, while Daisy leaned against Jenkins for a head scratch. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But here's the thing about people like Karen. Humiliation doesn't stop them. It fuels them. And sure enough, as the officers wrapped up their visit and Jenkins signed off on yet another confirmation of my compliance, I could see it in her eyes. The calculation, the silent promise that she wasn't done. She'd lost this round, but she wasn't going to quit. And honestly, that's exactly what I wanted. Because here's the dirty little secret Karen never considered. Every escalation she made gave me more ammunition. More evidence. More witnesses. And the more she clawed at me, the deeper she dug her own hole. My job required meticulous records, session logs, certifications, client testimonials, and I had them all neatly filed. Every HOA notice she sent went straight into a binder. Every anonymous letter got tucked away. Every little stunt she pulled was becoming part of a growing mountain of receipts. She thought she was bleeding me dry with stress. What she didn't realize was that she was giving me the very tools I'd use to destroy her position in the HOA. As the last cruiser rolled away, Karen lingered in the street, arms folded, glaring at me like she could scorch my barn to ashes with sheer hatred. I met her stare, calm as ever, and in that moment, I swear she knew, deep down, that she hadn't just lost a battle. She'd set herself up for a war she couldn't possibly win. Because I was done playing defense. Next came my move. By the time the flashing lights disappeared down the street, I already knew Karen was drafting her next move. People like her don't retreat. They reload. And sure enough, the very next morning, a pristine envelope stamped with the HOA logo appeared in my mailbox, as if it had been waiting in the shadows for the perfect dramatic entrance. Inside, a final warning. Apparently, the HOA board had decided my barn and my therapy animals were detrimental to neighborhood aesthetics. Aesthetics. As if goats munching hay were somehow less picturesque than Karen's peeling garden gnome collection. I didn't yell. I didn't rant. I didn't even crumple the letter. Instead, I slid it into my growing binder, a 3-inch thick arsenal of pettiness, rules, counter-rules, and federal protections. This binder wasn't just paperwork. It was my war chest. Every citation Karen tried to throw at me had a tab. Every false complaint had its own page. And behind each tab, I had receipts, inspection reports, licenses, signed affidavits from clients, even photographs of therapy sessions. If Karen wanted a paper war, she had no idea I was fluent in bureaucratic combat. But here's the thing. I didn't just want to survive her harassment. I wanted to make her regret it. So, I started laying my groundwork. Subtle. Quiet. Strategic. I began documenting everything. Not just her letters, but her behavior. Security cameras went up around the barn, motion-sensitive lights installed along the fence line. At first glance, they looked like basic home protection, but in reality, they were my surveillance net. If Karen so much as set foot near my property, I'd have time-stamped proof. And knowing her, temptation would eventually get the better of her. Meanwhile, I got proactive. I reached out to every client who had benefited from my therapy animals, parents of autistic kids, veterans, trauma survivors, and asked if they'd be willing to provide written statements about their experiences. Not a single one hesitated. In fact, most of them wrote pages longer than Karen's complaints, full of gratitude, healing, and real stories of lives changed. One mom even sent me a photo of her son hugging Daisy, captioned, "The goat who gave my child back his smile." I printed it, slipped it into the binder, and smiled. Karen wanted to frame me as a nuisance. I was about to paint myself as a lifeline. And then, the HOA meeting happened. If you've never been to one of these suburban gladiator arenas, count yourself lucky. Imagine a room full of folding chairs, stale coffee, and middle-aged warriors clutching bylaws like swords. Karen, of course, sat front and center, armed with a stack of evidence that probably included grainy photos of my chickens pecking grass. I walked in with my binder. Thick, heavy. A statement in itself. When I placed it on the table, the thud echoed like a gavel. Heads turned. Karen's smile faltered. The board started with their usual routine, reading complaints, debating interpretations of rules, acting like they were the Supreme Court of lawn maintenance. Karen launched into her tirade, claiming my animals were disruptive, dangerous, and damaging community harmony. She used the word harmony at least 3 times, each one sharper than the last. I waited, patient. Let her dig her hole. And then it was my turn. I opened the binder. Slowly, methodically, and I began to speak. Not with anger, not with desperation, but with calm, clinical precision. I read off certification numbers, quoted federal statutes, held up signed affidavits from licensed professionals. I even slid across photographs of therapy sessions, children laughing beside goats, veterans sitting peacefully with chickens on their laps. Each page I turned was another nail in the coffin of her argument. The room shifted. You could feel it. Board members who had nodded along to Karen's venom now leaned forward, brows furrowed, realizing the liability they'd inherit if they sided with her. ADA protections aren't suggestions, they're ironclad law. And if the HOA tried to strip me of my animals, they wouldn't just be keeping the neighborhood pretty. They'd be courting a federal lawsuit. Karen's face twisted, cycling through shades of disbelief, rage, and panic. She tried interrupting, tried talking over me, but every word out of her mouth only made her look more unhinged. The board chair finally had to gavel her down, reminding her to let me finish. And when I did, when I closed the binder with a decisive snap, the silence that followed was delicious. The board didn't vote that night. They claimed they needed to review the documentation. But the damage was already done. For the first time, Karen wasn't the untouchable queen of compliance. She was a liability. And she knew it. But she wasn't done, not by a long shot. Because when bullies lose control, they don't back down. They lash out. And that's exactly what Karen did. The very next week, my mailbox was mysteriously smashed to pieces. My garbage cans overturned. Strange footprints appeared near the barn gate at night. It was subtle enough to be brushed off as coincidence, but obvious enough that I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen had shifted from paperwork to sabotage. And in doing so, she gave me exactly what I needed. Because sabotage can be denied. But it can also be recorded. And I had cameras. The footage was almost cinematic. The grainy night vision glow painted Karen like some amateur cat burglar, except instead of sleek black clothes and stealth, she wore her usual blindingly bright floral pajamas and fuzzy slippers. Around 2 in the morning, she crept across the property line, tiptoeing like a child sneaking cookies. Only the cookies, in this case, were my barn gates. She tugged on the latch, rattled it with both hands, then stomped when it didn't budge. The camera caught everything. Her frustration, her muttering, even the moment she kicked a bucket and nearly fell over. When I watched the playback the next morning, coffee in hand, I laughed so hard I nearly spilled the mug. It wasn't just evidence. It was art. The kind of footage that belonged in one of those World's Dumbest Criminals shows. And the best part? She had no idea I had her performance saved in full 1080p glory. Now, I could have marched straight to the police with that video. I could have filed a harassment report, pressed charges, made her life instantly miserable. But where's the fun in playing your ace too early? No, Karen was a marathon project, not a sprint. And I knew if she thought she was getting away with it, she'd only escalate further, digging herself deeper into a hole she wouldn't be able to climb out of. So I waited. And sure enough, over the next 2 weeks, Karen gave me an entire highlight reel. Her knocking over my garbage cans at midnight. Her spraying water at my chicken coop from her side of the fence. Her sneaking into my driveway to slap another anonymous note under my windshield wiper. It was relentless, childish, and absolutely perfect. Because every frame went into my ever-growing archive of Karen versus reality. Meanwhile, I played my role flawlessly, the unbothered neighbor. I waved at her when I saw her on the street. I smiled politely at HOA board members. I carried on therapy sessions as usual, cheerful and unshaken, while inside, I was stockpiling enough ammo to launch a lawsuit that would make the HOA tremble. And tremble they did. The next HOA meeting was tense. You could feel it in the air before anyone even sat down. Karen strutted in, papers clutched like a manifesto, clearly ready to resume her crusade. But the board looked tired, deflated. wary. They'd received enough of my documentation to realize they weren't just dealing with a stubborn neighbor, they were staring down potential federal liability. The ADA isn't something you trifle with, and my binder had spelled out, in excruciating detail, what would happen if they sided with Karen's vendetta. Still, Karen couldn't resist. She launched into a fresh tirade about barnyard chaos, claiming my animals were terrorizing the neighborhood. She painted herself as the lone guardian of order, the only one brave enough to stand against my supposed circus. And that's when I pulled out the first card from my secret deck. I didn't say a word at first. I simply slid a USB drive across the table. The board chair frowned, confused, but plugged it into the laptop connected to the projector. And there, larger than life on the meeting room wall, appeared Karen, in her pajamas, rattling my barn gate at 2 in the morning. The room erupted. Gasps. Whispers. One board member actually laughed out loud. Karen's face drained of color as she spun in her chair, sputtering excuses about checking for safety hazards and misunderstood intentions. But the footage spoke louder than any excuse could. There she was, crystal clear, trespassing and vandalizing. I didn't push it further that night. I didn't need to. The silence that followed the video was enough. The board cut the meeting short, claiming they needed to discuss matters privately, which we all knew was code for we're in over our heads and Karen is about to sink us all. Karen left in a storm, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. And that's when I knew she wasn't done. The humiliation burned too hot for her to quit. She would come back swinging harder, more desperate, more reckless. And that was exactly what I needed. Because the deeper she spiraled, the more untouchable my case became. Sure enough, the escalation came fast. Within days, I received another official notice, not from the HOA, but directly from Karen herself. A cease and desist letter she'd clearly cobbled together from some free template online, demanding I remove all animals, structures, and therapy signage within 7 days or face further legal consequences. The letter was laughable. No lawyer's signature. No official letterhead. Just Karen's scrawled name at the bottom in looping cursive. I tucked it into the binder, right where it belonged. But I'll admit, even I didn't predict her next move. Because humiliation and desperation are a volatile mix, and Karen was about to light herself on fire with both. Late one evening, just as the sun was sinking and the sky turned that deep shade of bruised purple, I saw flashing lights again, this time not from cruisers, but from a fire truck. And guess whose frantic 911 call had brought them? Karen's. She had reported my barn as a fire hazard. The fire truck roared into the neighborhood like a red beast, sirens blaring, lights scattering across the cul-de-sac as though the entire block were about to burn down. Neighbors spilled out onto their lawns in bathrobes and slippers, craning necks, whispering, pointing toward my barn. And right in the middle of the crowd, who else but Karen, arms flailing, voice shrill, performing for an audience like she was auditioning for Broadway. She pointed dramatically at the barn, screaming about flammable materials, animal waste, and public danger. To hear her tell it, you'd think I was storing barrels of gasoline and fireworks inside instead of hay bales and therapy animals. Her performance was so over the top, I half expected her to faint into someone's arms like a silent film star. The firefighters, professionals to the bone, didn't indulge her theatrics. They inspected calmly, checking the barn structure, the wiring, the feed storage. One even crouched to pat Daisy, who nuzzled his helmet like he was just another client in need of therapy. After 30 minutes of thorough checks, they emerged with the official verdict. No hazards, no violations, nothing remotely unsafe. My barn wasn't just legal, it was exemplary. Karen's jaw practically hit the pavement. She stammered, demanded a second inspection, accused the firefighters of being bribed. That last part drew audible chuckles from the gathered neighbors. For the first time, the crowd wasn't murmuring in sympathy with her, they were laughing at her. And that's when I realized, Karen wasn't just losing her battle against me. She was losing the neighborhood. Because here's the thing about people like her, they thrive in secrecy, in whispered complaints and private letters. But when their antics get dragged into the open air, under flashing lights and in front of witnesses, the mask slips. And in that moment, Karen's carefully curated role as the vigilant protector of the community crumbled into the obvious truth. She was nothing more than a petty bully with too much free time. I didn't rub it in. Not yet. I stood quietly, hands in my pockets, watching her unravel while the firefighters shook their heads and packed up. But inside, the gears were turning. She had handed me exactly what I needed. Public humiliation, recorded on half a dozen smartphones, in front of nearly the entire HOA. All I had to do now was weave it into my grand finale. The next morning, I paid a visit to the county clerk's office. A little paperwork here, a notarized statement there, and I had the beginnings of a formal harassment and defamation case. Between the binder, the videos, the false reports, and now the fire hazard stunt, the evidence was stacked higher than the hay in my loft. And I wasn't just aiming at Karen anymore. I was aiming at the HOA board that had enabled her. Because let's be real, the board had tolerated her nonsense for years. They'd let her play enforcer, let her weaponize bylaws, let her intimidate anyone who didn't fit her vision of community harmony. And now, with one lawsuit, I could hold them accountable too. The beauty of it, they knew it. They could see the storm coming. And unlike Karen, they weren't dumb enough to believe they could win. That week, I received an unexpected knock at my door. 2 board members stood there, looking sheepish, holding a letter. It was an official clarification from the HOA stating that my therapy animals were, in fact, fully protected and permitted. They wanted to resolve the misunderstanding. Translation: they wanted to distance themselves from Karen before my lawyer's pen scorched their checkbooks. I accepted the letter with a smile, tucked it into the binder, and thanked them politely. But I wasn't about to let them off that easy. Not yet. Because Karen, oblivious to her crumbling support, kept pushing. She doubled down with another barrage of anonymous notes. She stormed through the neighborhood ranting about conspiracies. She even tried organizing a petition to have me removed, though only 3 people signed it, and one of them crossed their name out the next day. The more she flailed, the more isolated she became. And I let her. I let her stew in her own desperation, gathering every last piece of evidence, every last tantrum, every last outburst. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I wasn't just prepared. I was armed for absolute demolition. The binder was thicker than ever. The flash drive was loaded with her greatest hits: trespassing, vandalism, fire hazard theatrics. I had witness statements, legal notices, and even a preliminary lawsuit draft tucked neatly into a folder. It wasn't just a defense anymore. It was an execution. And when I walked into that meeting, calm, collected, binder in hand, I knew exactly how the night would end. Because this wasn't just about shutting Karen up. This was about ending her reign once and for all. The community center buzzed like a hornet's nest before the meeting even started. Word of Karen's fire hazard fiasco had spread like wildfire, ironically more effective than her actual complaint. Neighbors who once nodded along to her rants now whispered in clusters, casting sideways glances at her as she sat rigid in the front row, jaw tight, clutching her papers like a lifeline. I walked in with my binder under one arm and a folder in the other. Steady, almost cheerful. Because tonight wasn't about defending myself anymore. Tonight was about ending this, once and for all. The board opened with their usual formalities, but you could see the exhaustion in their eyes. They weren't in control of this meeting. Not anymore. Karen jumped in as expected, launching her tirade. Animals, smells, noise, safety, the same tired carousel of accusations. Her voice cracked under the strain, but she pushed harder, desperate, like sheer volume might compensate for her crumbling credibility. And then I stood. I placed the binder on the table with that familiar thud. Only this time, I didn't start with certifications or statutes. No, tonight, I started with the footage. The projector screen lit up with Karen's late-night escapades. Pajamas, slippers, rattling my barn gate like a burglar, spraying my chicken coop, stuffing notes under my windshield. The room gasped, laughed, murmured. Karen's face turned crimson, her hands shaking as she shouted protests, out of context, doctored, invasion of privacy. But every word only made her look more unhinged. Then came the fire hazard call. Clips from neighbors' phones showed Karen shrieking in the street, firefighters calmly inspecting and finding nothing. The crowd laughed again, this time louder. You could feel the tide fully turning. I didn't smile. Not yet. I let the silence stretch after the videos ended, let Karen squirm in her chair, let the board absorb the weight of what they'd just seen. And then, with quiet precision, I laid down the folder. Inside, a formal letter of intent to sue both Karen and the HOA for harassment, defamation, and violation of federal protections under the ADA. The board chair's face drained of color as he skimmed the first page. He knew exactly what it meant: attorneys, fees, headlines, liability. The HOA's carefully guarded budget would bleed out in legal costs before Karen could even sharpen her next complaint. And that's when I delivered the final blow. From the binder, I pulled letters from my clients, veterans, parents, children, all testifying to the therapy animal's impact. I read a few aloud, my voice steady, deliberate. A mother describing how her autistic son spoke his first full sentence while brushing Daisy's coat. A veteran explaining how the chickens calmed his panic attacks. Each word painted my animals not as nuisances, but as lifelines. By the time I finished, half the room was misty-eyed. The contrast was undeniable. On one side, Karen, bitter, petty, destructive. On the other, a community service backed by law, compassion, and proof. The board didn't deliberate long. They voted unanimously to formally exempt my property and therapy animals from all HOA restrictions. Effective immediately. Ironclad. Permanent. Karen's war was over. But her personal consequences weren't. The board chair, weary and ashamed, announced that Karen was being stripped of her role as compliance officer effective immediately. Gasps filled the room. Karen sputtered, raged, stormed out, slamming the door so hard a ceiling tile rattled loose. She was done. The neighborhood exhaled. People actually clapped. A few even came up to me after, shaking my hand, apologizing for not standing up sooner. And as I walked home that night, binder under my arm, barn lights glowing softly in the distance, I felt the kind of victory that wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about reclaiming peace. The animals, oblivious to the war they just helped me win, greeted me at the gate. Daisy nuzzled my arm, bleating softly. I scratched behind her ears and couldn't help but laugh. Karen had tried to strip away what gave these animals purpose. Instead, she'd immortalized them as the heart of our community. And here's the delicious symmetry. Remember that cold open, the smugness on her face when the officers first arrived? That was the peak of her power. Tonight was the echo of its collapse. Checkmate. So, if you've ever dealt with a Karen, an HOA nightmare, or a neighbor drunk on their own entitlement, you already know, revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a binder. Sometimes it's patience. And sometimes, it's letting someone dig their own grave while you quietly hand them the shovel. Now, I've shared my HOA horror story. What about you? Drop your own Karen or HOA nightmares in the comments. I read every single one. Who knows, your story might just be the next one I tell.